Well, let's join the Rise News correspondent Philip Crowther, who is in Glasgow, to give us an update on the summit. Hello, Philip. Great to see you. Messages of doomsday all over. UK Prime Minister says the world is strapped to doomsday device, just as in the James Bond movie, only that this time around it's not a movie. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres says by failing to respond, countries were digging their own graves. So clearly, world leaders do understand how serious this is. But is it too early for me to ask if COP26 is any different from past rhetorics? Are we going to see any difference, Philip?
Well, look, this is what happens during the first 2 days of one of these climate conferences. It starts with this World Leaders Summit, 2 days during which heads of state and heads of government get to speak for, well, exactly 3 minutes, sometimes go over. US President Joe Biden, for example, went over by 8 minutes, but they essentially get to say what they are willing to dedicate to fight climate change. And there were some stark messages there from the likes of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as you just heard, none more stark than Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who you also just listened to. And then you get some of those commitments from countries who we hadn't heard from yet, concrete commitments. For example, India saying that it wants to be net neutral when it comes to carbon emissions by the year 2070. Sounds late because most countries want to get this done by the year 2050. That is the ask here of participants here at the climate conference in Glasgow. So yes, it sounds 20 years too late. But a lot of experts would say, no, that pretty much fits entirely into that goal of keeping global warming from going no higher than 2 degrees Celsius and preferably no higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there are always two ways of looking at these speeches by world leaders. They certainly are supposed to motivate the negotiators thereafter, who will get down to the nitty-gritty, to the difficult work of actually coming to an agreement, something that can be shown to the world in exactly 12 days' time. And they will, of course, base their work on what their respective leaders will have said here on stage at the climate conference.
All right, Philip, I'll just ask you two questions quickly. This is called, or has been described as, a high-stakes climate conference. How high really are the stakes, and how much of a boom is the return of the US to the climate talks after Trump?
Well, look, most people will tell you that the stakes could not be higher. This is very much seen as the last chance saloon, to use the words of Prince Charles, but really the last chance for collective action, for a collective international agreement of 196 countries to combat climate change, to somehow put the brakes on it at this last moment. Because what we're dealing with here is essentially the rule book that is being created, written here by these negotiating teams, that is based on the Paris Climate Agreement from 2015. And that is precisely the agreement that said the goal was to keep global warming preferably to only 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, of course, we're already seeing the results of climate change in a lot of places around the world, and some of those where climate change is really wreaking havoc already in developing countries, in poorer countries. They are the ones that are expecting at this point to get more money dedicated from rich countries toward their causes back home. Now, you mentioned the role of the United States. It has, of course, changed drastically from the last 4 years, and that is something that the Biden administration wanted to make clear here. You actually heard President Joe Biden say sorry, present his excuses for what his predecessor Donald Trump had done. And of course, what he had done was pull the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement from COP21. That was in 2015. The United States wants to be a leader when it comes to all of these discussions about climate change. And I think most countries here are pretty happy to see the United States very much back at the table. And it will be able to cajole other countries into making commitments maybe similar to the one that the United States wants to make. And that is, again, that magic date, if you will, of 2050, by which time a lot of these countries have promised that they want to be carbon neutral. Other countries have not made those promises. Maybe the United States can help get them there.
All right. Indeed. Philip, let me ask you, the world's lesser polluters are the ones most affected by the effects of climate change, as we are beginning to see the likes of Africa. But what are they likely to get out of this summit this time around? Any concrete measures for countries in Africa and those who are the lesser polluters in the world?
There are concrete measures that should be made available during this conference, and based on the discussions that I've had with African delegations here and the negotiators on behalf of some African countries, the likes of Central African Republic, whose main negotiator I spoke to, for example, the main goal here is really to get that financing from the richer countries, to get that finally organized, and to keep that, to have that promise kept by the richer countries. And that promise, remember, also comes from previous climate conferences, to make $100 billion available to those poorer developing countries who are already feeling the effects of climate change. That's $100 billion per year that was supposed to be available to those countries from the year 2020 onward. That has not happened yet. That quantity has never been reached. So this is supposed to be the first climate conference where we see that number reached for the first time, where we find out exactly who is going to give how much money and how that number will be reached. And that is the absolute priority. There is no doubt about that for many African countries, but Pacific Islands as well, for example, that are suffering from climate change already. That is the absolute priority right now. And that is something that you're seeing in these negotiating rooms all around where I'm standing right now, where different groups are getting together. And you can be sure that those who are suffering from climate change already, those who need financing, will be pushing that as hard as possible during these next 12 days.
All right, Philip, and then of course there's the question of Guterres saying that mistrust among G20 could cost us to fail. But we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Philip Crowther, RISE correspondent reporting from Glasgow.